longest time, there has been this misconception of teenagers that they are misbehaved, angsty, and unruly, although the angsty part might be true. This misleads most of the current generation's parents, especially since they might have done some bad things when they were teenagers. With that stated, most parents within the past few decades are probably the most familiar with the typical teenager stereotype. A lot of the authority nowadays comes from parents who are former teens, who construe ideas of today's generation and what the teens of this generation might do. In order to limit any possible misbehavior, curfews were put in place. Even to this day, curfews are laid to enforce a stricter rule guidance to teenagers. However, the thoughts on curfews are flawed for many reasons. But for one, not all teens misbehave. A lot of the teens of this generation, they listen to their parents, they follow the rules. Two, people still sneak out. So even if curfews were laid, it's not positive that all teenagers would abide by the rules. Some might be rebels, some might not follow the rules. And three, it's just outright unconstitutional. The stereotyping about teens has always been negative in the first place. Although it's sometimes true, it's not always valid for everyone. A lot of what people hear and say comes from bad experiences or gossip and rumors. In 1995, mayors in many cities placed curfews that stopped teens from going outside between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. However, there was never any proof that the youth curfews that they had set had actually lowered crime. Some crime rates had been lowered, but they couldn't tie it to the teens themselves. Chris Parker, a 17-year-old at the time, explained that he had worked hard to get his parents to let him have a 12:30 curfew. Since most parents wouldn't condone inappropriate actions, it's very likely that they trust Chris enough to give him a later curfew, which they do, and they ended up extending his curfew longer. Robert Polkin, an ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union spokesperson, said, "Normally, police aren't supposed to stop someone unless they have a reasonable cause. But a curfew makes it a crime just to be out on the street. If it's a crime to be out on the street, then the assumption is that all teens are guilty of this stereotype. This causes innocent teens to be criminalized, all of which are based on faulty rumors." For decades and decades, the world has been defined by rules and laws. Regardless of the laws that are made, there will always be a small group of rebels, people who don't listen and people who will never continue to follow the rules. There are many cases where teenagers have exceptions to needing to go past curfew. One would be teenage pregnancy. In a situation where this 16-year-old mom was responsible for tending to her child, she was deemed legally old enough to care for her child alone, but she was too young to stay out past 11. To abide by two conflicting rules would surely be a problem for teenage moms and teenagers in other situations, such as having jobs or working late-night shifts. Robin Blumner, journalist and civil rights expert, stated, "If the officials of Dallas, Atlanta, and Florida, and the numerous other cities around the country that have passed juvenile curfews believe that curfews will deter a teen bent on crime, they are woefully misinformed. All these ordinances will do is restrict law-abiding teens' freedom of movement and teach our newest and most impressionable citizens that, like alcohol and tobacco, the Constitution is for adults only." Robin makes a great point by referring to the Constitution as something that applies to everyone. Rather than regulating laws to affect everyone, instead punish the teens deserving of the consequences and leave the innocents. To deter teens even more, regulations could be increased. They could be raised to be of a higher consequence, lessening any urges for any teens to do anything bad or break rules. Now, as kids, there may have been times where we've challenged the law and challenged some rules that our parents gave us. Since the idea of a curfew isn't a very popular opinion, at least to most teenagers, especially the well-behaved ones, there's a high likelihood that teenage rebels would appear. Well, a case in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania showed a similar situation that shows just that. They wanted to extend their curfew from 11 p.m. to 1:30 in the morning. However, they weren't convincing their parents. They had written a letter to their local police chief, and in the end, they ended up extending the curfew because he agreed to their terms. Now, most rules are made to prohibit bad behavior, but they aren't supposed to restrict people's freedoms. They should be a line that people can follow. The ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union, calls curfews unconstitutional themselves. There was even a case in Vernon, Connecticut, that won and removed curfew from the books. That case changed so many people's minds, people were ecstatic, and they agreed that the curfew should be something that stayed between parents and children. In conclusion, curfew laws are just way too limiting. People can stop the curfews by small things, such as spreading the word, petitioning, or other larger things, as in calling the state governor, the mayor, or city officials. Think about a teen in this day and age. Imagine how limiting curfews would be and how restrictive someone would feel. Help the innocent teens, don't cause more rebellions, and give back teens their freedom.